Hello, friends. How are you? I feel like I was just noticing my camera. I feel like I've got some really awesome, like fuzzy background happening. It might just be me. I know you don't end up looking at this actual screen a whole lot, but if it's bothering anyone, let me know. Um, my camera may just be sort of extra focused today. Who knows? Who knows? Anyway, hi, everybody. Happy Wednesday. It's a delight to see you all, as it always is. And I always love these Wednesdays when I get a full screen of people. Gosh, it just makes me so happy. I actually, I picked this for the monthly one because I just happen to love Vermouth so much. So I figured it'd be really fun for me. And I'm glad that y'all feel like coming right along because that always makes me happy too. But it is also super fun because it's a little bit different from the other ones that we've been talking about this month, in the sense that it is still technically a fortified wine, but it doesn't have quite that kind of designation that like sherry does, or Madeira, or port, or all of these things. Hello, Andrew. Lovely to see you. He's saying he's looking forward to learning about vermouth because the only thing I know is how my dad says you use it in a martini. Yeah. You should, this is absolutely, and I love this because that is, so he's saying is how my dad said you use it in a martini, you show the bottle to the martini and then pull it away immediately. And this is very, very true. And this is ingrained in sort of American, I think, culture of the martini, the cocktail itself, and of vermouth in general. And there's a little history, we'll get into that, or I'll kind of pontificate on for a moment when we get there. But it is very, very interesting that you have so much sort of disparaging, because vermouth is an amazing kind of drink as well. Vermouth doesn't have that same kind of protection or any kind of designation the same way that things like sherry does, and Madeira, and next week when we talk about port. These are all very specific countries, regions, styles that are defined by law. Vermouth doesn't have that kind of specificity, let us say. So it's always kind of a mystery, and there's a lot of iterations of it. If anyone's had Massachin's vermouth, tell Dan. I have not, Dan. But the idea being that wine is fortified and aromatized. In a brief statement, it's basically wine that's been spiked with some brandy, and you throw some herbs and roots and other flavorings in there. So it's a melange of a couple of different ideas and concepts that over time have become this sort of, in our general idea right now, this sort of back side hustle to a cocktail. Which in all fairness, it has become that in a lot of people's minds, but is of course making a very, very large comeback right now in both the common drinker and also very much so in the bartending and the cocktail culture that has become much more prevalent these days in the past couple decades, I'd even say, the cocktail revolution, if you will. But technically, fortified and infused with a proprietary blend of herbs and spices and or roots, things like that. So historically, where does it come from, this idea of infusing herbs into tonics or through alcohol? Is not a new concept. It's very, very old. In fact, this is going all the way back to, the Zhang dynasty from like 1250 BC. This is a huge important part of medicinal culture, because as it turns out, the truth is that you have the ancient Chinese with obviously lots of knowledge in terms of herbs and their benefits, and how do you deliver that system more efficiently into the body, which is sort of the origin of this kind of idea. Obviously, liquid form is always very easy to consume and also tends to be dispersed throughout the body a little bit more readily. Whether they knew that kind of technology then officially, I'm sure they knew that obviously just by proxy in terms of they figured it out, right? But so there was definitely a medicinal kind of bend towards it through Chinese history. And then of course, herb flavored wines were written about and talked about in ancient Greek and Roman times. Now, whether these wines were actually being flavored with the herbs for a particular medicinal purpose is kind of unlikely. More than likely, the Greeks and the Romans were actually adding the flavorings to their wines to cover up like bad wine, or wine that had sort of distilled into vinegar, or had sort of turned on its own, or hadn't been quite as potent, or hadn't been quite as flavorful in the way that they liked it. So there is definitely the idea that you can season your wine to help cover up some flavors, just like with bad meat. Sandra's mentioning right now at Vodka to go to get the House Vermouth de Grifo on the rocks. The House Vermouth at Vodka, I believe Michael is still, he's responsible for that particular recipe too. So he kind of makes that from scratch, which is really cool. And also very typical of these kind of artisan days of vermouth that we are in, which is really cool. But the whole purpose behind and how this becomes a thing, if you will, is that alcohol is a solvent. So this is true both within wine and then obviously when you get into distillation of spirits as well. Alcohol kind of increases the ability for infusions to occur. So anything that's placed in alcohol, flavors are extracted, aromas, color, will all be extracted into the liquid because alcohol helps to facilitate that process. So obviously this is where all sorts of things, bitters, tonics, medicinal liqueurs, these all kind of came with this idea that you're taking the medicinal properties of herbs, which is the origin of our healthcare system, if you will, and then, you know, creating a vessel for it through the alcohol and then into a liquid. And then oftentimes adding sugar to make it palatable because many of these herbs on their own tend to be very, very bitter. And this is true of all of these kind of brands of and categories of both spirits, aromatized wines, and fortifieds as well. But whenever you get into that medicinal bent, anything that has herbs in it, usually there's a little bit of a sweet and bitter component to all of those. And that's kind of because it comes from this historically sort of medicinal purpose. So vermouth in and of itself was originally kind of marketed for a medicinal purpose in particular, which we'll talk about why and what the main ingredient was. If you don't already know, it happens to be wormwood. So this is what I always think is really, really fun. Vermouth, the word vermouth is actually French, but it is the French pronunciation of the German word Vermouth, which is the German word for wormwood, as it turns out. Lots and lots of going around, but I always find that very fun because I think saying Vermouth is very, very satisfying. So I highly encourage you all to do that right now on your muted microphone, say Vermouth. But the idea is that wormwood was actually one of the primary ingredients that appeared in vermouth and also medicinal tonics for quite some time. It had been around. Mostly wormwood is known for its medicinal purpose of being sort of alleviating intestinal discomforts and stomach reasons, which intestinal parasites, things like that, which as it turns out tends to be the reason for a lot of these herbs. And when we talk and moving into the categories, it changes its name. A lot of it has to do with digestion, the aperitif, the digestif, this idea that these liqueurs, these liquids are helping to aid the digestive system, which is really, you know, from a medieval and kind of historical purpose, the digestive system is the functioning furnace of our bodies. So making sure that that is all running smoothly, in, out, all of the things, very, very important. And so obviously, you know, when we didn't have things like Pepto-Bismol, there were many other sort of more natural ways of facilitating a more functional body, as it turns out. So in Germany in the 16th century is when you start to see these fortified wines that are based around the main ingredient of wormwood or vermouth. And then eventually after that, soon after that, within the 1500s, you start to see more of the you see similar products that are popping up in Italy, and you see them in France as well. And actually as early as like 1500, this is sort of in the northern Piemonte region of Italy is where you kind of see this primarily focusing is these wormwood wines, right? Which is such an interesting thing, but it's really the same concept. It's wines that are being flavored with the wormwood root. Very interestingly, and a slight side note on wormwood, because it has a very, very storied history, right? And a very sort of notorious association. Wormwood is also the main ingredient of absinthe, for those of you who don't know, which is the liquor that is sort of touted as the, you know, the liquor that makes you go mad, right? To the little green fairy that kind of makes you go crazy. And one of the reasons that wormwood was actually in the early 20th century, or not early 20th century, but later 20th century, for a period of time was actually removed as an allowable ingredient within liquors because they felt that it had detrimental properties to human beings, that there was a poisoning effect of it. Now, in actuality, the wormwood, the reason that is, there's actually a specific ingredient that it's attributed to called thujone. I always found this very fascinating. And thujone is basically a monoterpene, one of those kind of aromatic and like chemical compounds that are found naturally in products, but it does have in very, very large amounts, a toxic effect on humans. But in all of history, there was only one actual death that was identified and recorded specifically attributed to thujone, and it was a guy basically drinking just like pure thujone in water, essentially, just lots and lots of it that he thought was absinthe, but it was really just like concentrated thujone elixir, and so he died. But the reality is that most of the famous people who went mad drinking absinthe most likely were just drunk. Most likely they were just very drunk. And also there was sort of a period of time during that era where people were starting to make things on their own, and the regulations weren't necessarily as strict, let us say. So there was the opportunity to for imperfections in the liquor that would also potentially cause toxic hazards and things like that. Sandra is asking, were Blanc or Rouge the most prevalent when it's introduced? I will get to that, and we will chat all about it. Because the Blanc and the Rouge are two of the different styles the main styles that we focus on. So after Italy crops up in Italy and France, we see the history of vermouth sort of becoming variations in other countries as well. And then by the 17th century, mid 17th century, you see it prominently within England under the name vermouth, where it became mostly consumed as a medicinal liquor. So it was still being attributed for medicinal properties at that point. So how you make it is really pretty straightforward when it comes to fortified wines. You have a low alcohol base wine that is generally made from a neutral grape varietal, and primarily that is made from white grapes. So most bases are actually white grape based. The French versions, you'll see a lot of Claret Blanche and Picpoul being kind of the main grape varietals. And then in Italy, you'll see grapes varietals like Catarratto or Trebbiano. These are generally fairly high acid, rather neutral grapes. And because you're making a low alcohol base wine, so your base wine is really coming in at between 7 and 9% right now, which is very typical when we talk about the same kind of thing with sherry, or when we talk about other, fortified wines or wines that go through a secondary process. You're starting off with a base wine that is generally lower in alcohol because you are fortifying it with a spirit. Now, before you do that, the base wines that are made, and these wines may be aged before this process happens, before they get fortified, and they are also aged after they're fortified. But the wines themselves may be 2 to 4 years in barrel before you even get to the next part of fortification. If the wines are going to end up as sweet vermouth, oftentimes the sweetening agent is added before the fortification happens. So they will add some sort of sugar syrup, grape syrup, any kind of mistel kind of product, which is kind of like a boiled down grape juice kind of thing. Some sort of sweetening agent is added to the base wine before it's fortified. Then it's fortified and moved forward into the large barrels, usually for a little while. Now, what's important to know is that because the distillation process does allow you to actually infuse through the distillation process an alcohol or spirit with herbs and botanicals, the actual fortification agent may also contain different flavorings and different kind of aromas, if you will. Most of the time, though, it is they are just a neutral grape spirit that's added, and then once it's fortified, it is added to dry ingredients, generally speaking. So this is basically a maceration phase, right? So this is a proprietary blend of 8, 12, 20, 40, 69 different botanicals that make up the proprietary blend of the vermouth that we are having in that particular thing. Now, to be perfectly honest, in this day and age, a lot of times for consistency's sake and also for mass production, this isn't a small batch process. There's actually a concentrate that is made and then added to the fortified vermouth at the end, sort of mixed together, allowed to kind of assimilate, but then it goes out as a very, very consistent sort of low-end product. If you guys were buying and shopping around for vermouth, you probably noticed they don't tend to be that expensive, if you will, compared to things like, wines or cognacs or ports even. So this is generally not considered a high price item. So there is a lot of sort of mass manufacturing that's done. Now, to get to Sandra's question about the Blanc or the Rouge, now we have two main styles that vermouth comes in, generally speaking, sweet and dry. And the sweet version is often called Rosso or Rouge or sweet vermouth or Italian, because the Italian version, and that does not mean it has to come from Italy, but originally the Italian version was this darker colored, very, very deep, rouge sweet vermouth that came out to be sort of fuller bodied, usually a higher content of sugar. And this is again, very much in the original. And now right around the same time, a little bit later was when you saw the Bianco, the white version, the French version. They're all again referred to sometimes as, you know, white, dry, French, Bianco. These are lighter in color and body. These tend to be more bitter. They tend to have a less residual sugar. Now, the reality is, of course, that the truth is that the styles are not, again, defined by any specific regulations. So we will notice, those of you who have this imbued dry vermouth, it's not really bitter at all. It has a slight sweetness to it. And there's a lot of times that you will try other sweet vermouths that really don't taste sweet at all, that are extremely bitter and more astringent. Alessa, Punta Mese is technically in the category of a fortified and aromatized wine. Punta Mese is a vermouth that also has bittering agents mixed in with it. And I do talk about that in a minute when we talk about the Italian versions of vermouths as well. But yeah, so it's technically in the category of vermouth. Again, as I mentioned, this is a very broad category. There's no regional designation for this. There's no like aging requirements. There's actually no definition for how much sugar goes into a Rosso or a Bianco or a French or Italian. These are all sort of loose terms that are applied to an aromatized and fortified wine. So when we talk about Italy, the main guy we're talking about in terms of he's often credited with being the inventor of vermouth. Thank you, Sandra. Sandra is mentioning that there is the $50 to $80. Yes, I'm not even sure how to pronounce that. Izaguirre, 1884. Well, that sounds amazing. But so you can definitely spend some more money on that. I should really look that up and kind of see the history of that, because I think that there's definitely too, when you get into other categories of Italian digestifs and aperitifs, these can definitely start to add up as well. Antonio Benedetto Capano, he's recognized as the father of vermouth, the kind of creator of vermouth, but in reality, this was in 1763 in Turin, or 1786, I'm sorry. He sort of invented this idea of the modern vermouth concept that we have, and usually it's the sweet one. So he basically started with white wine, added a bunch of herbs, created 30 different iterations of this beverage that was essentially fortified lightly to help stabilize it, macerated in with darker colors as well, and then sweetened just a little bit because he wanted it to be more palatable for the ladies. He thought they would like it better than the local red wines if it had a little bit more sweetness to it. So just this idea of creating, again, that kind of, this is where vermouth moved from medicinal cocktail to aperitif, sort of fashionable drinking icon of the late 18th century, right? And this is where it starts to move forward from there as the medicinal purposes kind of fade away and we start looking at a more kind of party kind of time and using it for your general enjoyment. But there's more bitter variations such as Punta Mese, as we just talked about, that are a little bit more similar to Italian Amaros. And this is where we want to get into this kind of idea of, in Italy, I mean, vermouth and Amaro, these are separate categories specifically, but there's a lot of similarities in there when you talk about the different flavoring agents, the roots, the bitters, the herbs that are used within each. There's a lot of crossover in there. Generally speaking, Amaros, Italian Amaros, tend to be much more bitter. They tend to be focused more on those kind of the cynar, the artichokes, the bitters, the bitter almonds, the bitter orange, things like that. But you will still see some of those same flavoring agents, for example, in some dry vermouths as well. So Punta Mese is basically a collaboration of vermouth with a little bit Amaro mixed into it kind of together. So it's kind of goes back and forth. If anyone's ever had Punta Mese, it's very, very dark. It's fairly bitter. It's not very sweet at all. And that's what sort of bridges the gap towards kind of the Amaro classification as well. Now you have your French vermouths, which are your Blanco, your Bianco, your white, your dry vermouths in theory. And this was originally created by Joseph Noilly, and he's attributed with creating the first dry vermouth in the south of France. Lyon specifically is where he's from, but in the early 1800s. So again, we're talking about the same general area or era, I should say, but this is a little bit later than Carpano was making his own 30 variations on the sweet vermouth. But this again, it was basically focused around Picpoul and Clairette Blanche. It technically has a little bit, it has a very, very robust flavor profile, but more bitter, less sweet. Again, there's more of this kind of herbal aromatic note to the original version. And this is the version that was the first to be kind of introduced into the cocktail era, and specifically, of course, to our martinis, which are very components. It makes a main component both in Europe and then in America. Now, what ended up happening, the dry vermouths tend to, with their kind of more herbal notes to them, balance very nicely with gin. So oftentimes you'll see the blancs that are mixed with the gin because there's a great botanical aromatic quality that balances very nicely. Now, what ended up happening was the original recipe lost favor in the United States after Prohibition, when they were sort of, everyone was going back to sort of very, very strict gin cocktails and actually moving into even lighter spirits like vodka that were a little less flavorful. The original Noilly Prat dry vermouth recipe was too flavorful. It was disliked by essentially people. And additionally, I mean, it used to make up a very, very large component of a martini. We're talking more 50-50, and this has come down quite a bit. Bartenders definitely started to take a heavy hand away from it until finally you got to the point where a martini was just waving the bottle over the glass, or just, you know, giving it a sly look and then like waving it away, the way that Andrew's dad was talking about too. That was very much a common idea. So what ended up happening was Noilly Prat actually created a different version for the US market called Extra Dry, which has about half the amount of botanicals in there, is basically a light, less flavorful version of the original dry Noilly Prat white vermouth. So it's just interesting to kind of know that kind of difference in there. And these are two examples that are just two in a plethora of lots and lots of different producers, styles, running the gamut. Again, like we said, sweet to dry. It's hard to really define what your vermouth is going to taste like, or what your expectations will be. But generally speaking, in the United States, we're starting to see a little bit more of that vermouth being brought to the cocktail, and also to as making sort of its very, very pronounced flavor profile more acceptable and actually more enjoyable to people in cocktails, and both on its own, just like she was saying it there. Extra dry is lighter than dry, technically, yes, for the Noilly Prat specifically. So we have to remember that these terms, dry, extra dry, they're not really being categorically defined by any regulatory body. But for Noilly Prat, the original French dry, which is what this picture kind of shows, and then there is the Noilly Prat extra dry, which is more so the lighter version for Americans. And they do have amber, yes, amber, the ombre, and the rouge versions as well. And these are sort of, there are rosé vermouths out there. Sometimes there's a little bit of red wine that might be added to it. Again, the base wine is usually white, and a lot of the coloring either comes from coloring agents or the actual herbs that are extracted in there. So it's important to know caramel coloring is still very common to use in all categories of spirits, right? Because it sort of adds a light kind of almost sweetness to it, but mostly for color. And that's across the game, that runs the gamut of like whiskeys, and obviously a whole bunch of other various spirits as well. But so the coloring agent, the amber, is part of that kind of tradition. Most of this, again, is not necessarily done in sort of these small batches, although we're seeing so much more artisanal progression these days. So the quality of your vermouth does make a difference. And as I mentioned in the earlier iteration of the description, raise your eyes above that kind of bottom shelf level of vermouth, because we are all very, very familiar with Martini and Rossi. We're all very familiar with sort of your basic bartender categories, especially from like the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, where it's like the ubiquitous, that's been on the rail for like months, which is not the best way to actually store your vermouth, as it turns out, because once it's open, vermouth does its wine. It is fortified, so it lasts a little bit longer. But when we talked about it, even with sherry, like your Fino sherry is still need to be consumed within a week. Your vermouth should really be consumed a few weeks, maybe to a couple months, and you should absolutely refrigerate it in terms of extending the life of that bottle, and also and also just preserving it in terms of like reducing the amount of oxidation, because it'll oxidize just like any other wine. Sandra is speaking to imbue specifically. It's quite different than most blancs. It is quite different than most blancs, but we call it's I just really love this company. I think they do a beautiful job with this particular model. It is lighter. So this, in terms of dry, it does not have that same, there is wormwood in there, but there's a lot more of this luxurious kind of floral note to it. There's so much more of a, like a fruity floral note, which I think makes it much more enjoyable to me as just a straight up aperitif. And the company does also they have a sweet vermouth version that they actually don't make anymore. Is it the sweet vermouth or the other name for it? They stopped making it. The guy, it's in Oregon, and they have like one guy who knew the recipe for the other one that they were making, and he basically quit and took the recipe with him, and they can't even make that part of it. So it's kind of interesting for that. Ali is asking, where does chartreuse fall into this category? It's a category of its own. Chartreuse is a liqueur. So in the sense that it's not a vermouth, it's not an aromatized wine, it is a spirit, it's a liqueur, but it is basically like, it does have that herbal component. So chartreuse has the history with the monks, and anything that has an herbal component to it was originally based in some sort of medicinal purpose, right? So chartreuse falls in that category. Becherovka, yes. Also that same sort of bitter herbals, but in that case, the base it's spirit. So in this case, the base is wine that's being fortified partially with spirit, only to like between 15 and maybe 18% alcohol. Whereas when you get into those guys, you're working with spirit, but there's sugar added to it, which actually sort of reduces the general ABV, but we're starting off with spirit instead of starting off with wine, if that makes sense. But it is still in that same kind of general tone of medicinal herbal liqueurs. This is not considered an herbal liqueur. It is considered a wine. And then you've got, yes, no problem. And then vermouth, like wine, can be used for cooking, especially if it's past its prime. Generally speaking, when you think about using vermouth in recipes instead of wine, it tends to be more flavor forward than a wine. So you will get more flavoring out of it, which is maybe lovely, but just be aware of that as you're using that within your recipe. Your Bianco vermouths, or ones that aren't quite as sweet, but have that herbal component, are great for sort of more herb-based kind of fish dishes and sauces and things like that. So you may even want to grab vermouth instead of wine based on your recipe, especially if it's a vermouth that you've had before that has kind of, the blend of herbs that can have because like, just like with the imbue, as Sandra was saying, there's no, all of these categories, again, you kind of have to try them to really understand what their base component is. Lo-Fi is another one that does a vermouth that's California based as well. It's local, very, very different, very heavily anise flavored, right? Where it's still technically a dry vermouth, and you have all of this. Scott is saying, so we did this way wrong. We opened Sola Extra Dry just today, also have Martini Dry, but open for several months, and Gallo Sweet also open for several months. Lele, thank you. And I also didn't realize Lele was in the group. Big fan of the martini at the Halicamana Secret Bar, basically a vodka Vesper. I need to go to the Halicalini Secret Bar. That sounds great. So Scott brings up a great point. So yes, actually, I think Scott's having a wonderful opportunity to experience how vermouth past its prime can taste different from a vermouth that is freshly opened, just like wine. It doesn't quite turn to vinegar, but it doesn't stay fresh. And so many reasons, I think that's part of the myth of the bottle over the glass, because if you have a bottle of vermouth, the same bottle that's sitting on the rail for weeks and weeks, unrefrigerated, it's going to oxidize, and it's going to lose that freshness, lose that flavor, and start to taste off. So obviously you don't want that even with your liquor, with your gin or with your vodka. And of course, high quality vermouth commonly sipped as an aperitif over ice. This is more common to see, especially in Spain. Spain, they love it. You go places, you just drink vermouth. It's awesome. France, they'll do that as well. Italy, of course, and Portugal. These are kind of the four main countries that still have always kind of focused on the aperitif version of vermouth in a glass, which is lovely. At the same time, though, c'est la vie here in America. I feel like hopefully we're starting to get back to it. Sweet vermouths too, again, sometimes they can be cloyingly sweet, like that when we talk about that. Vermouth just doesn't go bad. It loses its flavor. I find a Blanc needs a fridge, Rouge takes a wine fridge. Yes, it doesn't go bad. Well, just like wine doesn't technically go bad. It just, it turns into vinegar and it changes the flavor of it. But vermouth doesn't, to me, have that same extremity of flavor profile variation, but I do think that it has a lot of, the benefit is, man, just keep it in the fridge for a little while. If you're not going to use it, don't toss it. Oh yeah, no, Gallo, keep the Gallo. That does sit on the bar forever. That used to be in so many cocktails. I remember when I started bartending how strange it was to always that bottle. It's so tall. It's so weird in the back. So these are some very, very classic cocktails. These recipes, of course, are just generic recipes. Every bartender will have their own version of this, but this is your basic idea for what you see. Martinis, they tend to be dry vermouth. The original martini, they said, was actually with sweet vermouth, but today, of course, it's dry vermouth. If you're using it 2 parts or more to 1 part dry vermouth, and in some cases, no vermouth, depending on how you feel about it. Negronis, these are the classic sort of Italian cocktails that will move into Campari. It uses Campari, which is one of the Amaro. It's in the Amaro family. And then the sweet vermouth, which will have kind of that component as well, and gin. So if you've ever had, I love Negronis. I think they're absolutely delicious. They're sort of like, you know, Italian, there's kind of like Italian Manhattans to me, which is really, really delightful. Manhattans, of course, rye whiskey generally, or any kind of bourbon, or any kind of, you can do a Manhattan with rum is really, really fun if you're into something different. Sweet vermouth again, and then you have some bitters that you add to that as well. Bitters are really just sort of like very, very small, more concentrated versions of exactly what we're talking about. Aromatized liqueurs that are just very, very distilled, concentrated, herbal tinctures to add and adjust flavoring. And then a perfect Manhattan is just, it doesn't mean that it's the best Manhattan you've ever had. We'll always, it just means that you're using half sweet vermouth and half dry vermouth in the Manhattan. Now, which sweet vermouth and which dry vermouth you're using, that will change the cocktail considerably, as we've just kind of discussed and been talking about, right? It all changes based on who's making it and what it is. I did a vintage vermouth tasting. You just never know. Will oxidize within hours, but please try it. There you go, Andrew. You've got homework now, Andrew. You should really try it. So this is what I make with my imbue. It is basically, I like to take the imbue dry vermouth that has that sort of floral note to it. I will add a little bit of gin to it, but kind of in the reverse of a martini. I'll actually do mostly vermouth, and then I'll just spike it with a little bit of gin if I'm feeling frisky, or not if I'm not. And then Fever Tree is a great tonic, but any tonic will do. They have an elderflower, which I think complements it very nice. And then a little bit of orange bitters, and a kumquat half is a really lovely kind of garnish is the word I was looking for, that's actually written there. But it gives that nice kind of citrus touch to it, and then you can also eat it afterwards, and it's quite delicious. But just serve it over ice. If you don't want the gin, just have it as a spritzer, also super delicious. And it's really, really lovely. I picked up a gin martini recipe in Barcelona that is pretty wild, but delicious. Gin, sweet vermouth, orange peel, pickled Spanish peppers. That sounds awesome. How interesting. It's really, really fun and exciting. I get pretty geeked out. I think cocktails are really cool. I love wine, obviously, but cocktails are very, as we can see, they get very creative. Is Suze a vermouth? I actually don't know. I'm not, for some reason, I'm blanking on Suze, Allie. I'm so sorry. Sandra, salinity makes everything better. Also pickled things, pickled sour. I like sweet and sour. That sounds like it has such an interesting kind of flavor combination, which I love. Any kind of a sweet and sour component, I think, is really lovely. So this is basically just my little cocktail recipe for you based on my imbue. And that's what I got. That's our little foray into the thing. I appreciate you all. Next month, if you're coming for the free webinar, it will be the first Wednesday. I'll have more of that information coming out next week. Next week again is port. Join me for that if you can. And cheers, everyone. Have a great weekend. Bye.